And now, ladies and gentlemen, to comment on America's foreign policy as it is made from Washington, a gentleman who has been a professional intelligence specialist of almost 30 years standing. He is editor and publisher of the fortnightly newsletter, The Herald of Freedom. He appears regularly in the intelligence report of the Review of the News. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Frank A. Capell.
Fellow Americans, I was asked by Scott Stanley, our editor, to talk about the State Department. The first thought that occurs to me is that the reason most of the people are here at the God Family and Country Rally is to learn the truth about many things that are going on that they haven't been told. The reason that many of the people at the head table are devoting their lives to fighting the communist conspiracy is that the American people have not been told, and this is the only way they are getting the information. We have many patriotic legislators in our states and in our government who have tried very hard to bring the truth to the American people, but they can only hold hearings and write reports. They do not run the newspapers, the radio, the television, or the magazines, or the communications media. And were the media reporting all of the facts which have been developed by the committees through the years, we would not have any reason to be here, because the American people would never tolerate what has been going on. In 1920, we had the Lusk Committee in the state of New York, who investigated communism not only in New York but throughout the entire United States. In 1930, we had the Fish Committee, Congressman Fish, volumes written about communists in every area of American life. In 1936, the McCormick Committee, from your Congressman McCormick from Massachusetts, again, an outline of the communist conspiracy throughout the United States. In 1938, Martin Dies, the Dies Committee, the Special Committee on American Activities, volume after volume. It would take you almost weeks to read all of the material, the sworn testimony, the documented facts which were developed by these patriotic congressmen, but it was not brought to the American people. Just a little snatch here and there. It was not taught in the schools. No references. The average person doesn't even know what is in these things. The Senate Internal Security Committee has held a long series of hearings, interlocking subversion in government departments. Volume after volume of subversion in government departments. Some of the people they exposed are still there. The Institute of Pacific Relations. Communist infiltration into the U.S. government by the House Committee on American Activities. I have in my library shelf after shelf, stacked to the ceiling, across a whole room, reports from various government and state committees exposing communism, and yet the average American doesn't even know these reports exist. They haven't been told. This is why we are here. This is why we are trying to do our job, to let the American people know the things that they haven't been told. Now, President Richard Nixon, while a candidate, told the American public on October 13th, 1968, that there was a need for a house cleaning in the State Department. Well, of course he knew that. He was on the House Un-American Activities Committee when they were investigating communist infiltration into the government. He sat there during these hearings, and he knew all about it. And so as a candidate, he said, we've got to do something about this. We've got to have a house cleaning. It's never been done, not even during the Eisenhower administration. He was telling the absolute truth. It had never been done, and it still hasn't been done. Now, the president was referring to security risks firmly entrenched in the various offices and embassies of the State Department. The subversives and security risks continue in important policy-making positions to the detriment of the security of the United States. As was pointed out to you, American Opinion Scoreboard magazine is probably one of the finest articles or publications I've ever read. I am fortunate enough to have been given the opportunity to write a 14-page article on the State Department. I assure you, you'll find it eye-opening. Now, the penetration of our government, not the universities and the churches and so forth. I'm limiting myself now to the government and narrowing it down to the State Department. The penetration of our government by communist, Soviet agents and security risks can be traced back primarily to the Roosevelt administration, when we had on the White House staff itself Soviet agents, Lachlan Curry, Harry Hopkins, David Niles, Michael Greenberg. In the Treasury Department, Soviet agents, communists, Harry Dexter White, Frank Coe, Solomon Adler, Harold Glasser, Victor Perlo, William Ullman, all identified by witnesses before Senate committees, sworn testimony as espionage agents and communists. They held key important positions in various parts of our government. Now, there were other communists and Soviet agents scattered through the various government agencies and departments. As the State Department grew, the communists recommended their co-conspirators for employment, they covered up for them, they arranged for their promotion, and the new influx did the same. Two of the key individuals in the State Department, contrary to what anybody may think, were not only Alger Hiss, but his brother Donald Hiss. And by the way, it just came out recently that Donald Hiss is the administrator, the attorney for the estate of the late Felix Frankfurter, who recommended over 150 of his left-wing students from Harvard University into various parts of our government. As I recall it, it was President Theodore Roosevelt who referred to Felix Frankfurter as a Bolshevik. But at any event, Felix Frankfurter, as a Supreme Court justice, testified as a character witness for Alger Hiss. And he planted his people, and Alger Hiss and his brother brought them in throughout the government. Donald Hiss is today an important attorney in Washington in Dean Acheson's old law firm. As soon as he was removed from the State Department because of being identified as a Soviet agent and a communist, he was taken into Dean Acheson's law firm. Now, our government knew about the infiltration of communist, subversive Soviet agents. As a matter of fact, the American public didn't know anything about Alger Hiss until the late 1940s. But in 1938, the FBI sent a report, and an assistant secretary of state also prepared a report, which was given to the Secretary of State and the President of the United States, listing a whole group of Soviet agents who had made penetration, including Alger Hiss. So he remained in his key position 7 years after it was known. And during those 7 years, he brought in one after the other of his friends, and they brought in others. And it grew and it grew. On November 23, 1945, an intelligence agency of our government made available to the key agencies and the President a detailed report naming 80 Soviet agents, 37 of them in the U.S. government. Not communists, Soviet agents. It also developed there were 4 Soviet espionage groups operating within the government, 2 of which were made known through Whittaker Chambers and Mrs. Elizabeth Bentley. President Nixon was thoroughly familiar with this entire document since he referred to it himself in a speech while a congressman. As a result of the consolidation of war agencies after World War II, a large number of personnel were transferred into the State Department, including over 1,000 from the OSS, many of whom were known to be communists. As a result of investigations conducted by the House Committee on American Activities and the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, the State Department security officials undertook an investigation of all employees above a certain pay grade. Now, bear in mind that these hearings contain valuable information. In the State Department security hearings conducted by the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, there are 20 volumes over 1 million words. Most people don't even know they exist. It tells the story of Otepka and his assistants and how they tried to do their job and how they were blocked, of the cover-up of security risk, the destruction of FBI reports. It is absolutely replete with positive documentation. I challenge any journalist to read through this and not come to the conclusion that the State Department has been rampant with subversion, negligence, incompetence, and, if you please, treason. Now, in the 1950s, the late Scott McCloud, former FBI man who had been charged with security, testified that over 1,000 homosexuals have been separated from the State Department when he was in charge of security. A review of personnel and security files, together with updated investigations, was undertaken under the direction of Otto Otepka. By the way, this past Monday he handed in his retirement papers, and that is another long story. As well as over 800 individuals whom they found to be security risks, 250 of whom, approximately, were very serious security risks involving communism, contact with Soviet agents, sex perversion, and other serious matters. The Secretary of State was notified of the serious problem. No action was taken except to cover up, to overrule the security officers, and before the hearings, to even deny that such an investigation and such records even existed. In the meantime, the security risks continue to be promoted, moved into more and more important positions, these very same people that we're talking about. Among the serious security risks referred to was an unpublished group which had been reported by an intelligence agency to the State Department as being under Soviet control. For the first time in the United States, I am certain the information concerning the third group within the State Department has been made public through American Opinion magazine, and I am giving it to you here. It has been known by our intelligence agencies since 1947. It has been known by the State Department. Absolutely nothing was done except to cover it up. Now, who were these people? I'm going to name them, as I always name people, because you can't fight shadows. Number one, Robert Barnett, who was recently, now mind you, these people were reported by an intelligence agency of our own government to other government departments to warn them that these men are under Soviet control. Anyone who is under Soviet control becomes an agent of the Soviets. This is the purpose of placing them under control. Now, Robert Barnett was just recently retired as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asian Affairs, which included Vietnam. His wife, Patricia, also has a subversive file, is now and has been for a number of years a specialist in the State Department's intelligence office. She, too, was reported as a serious security risk. Lawrence G. Vass, VASS, who retired not long ago after having served in high positions in Germany, Australia, and Africa. Benjamin T. Moore, who was Assistant Coordinator of Foreign Aid and, unbelievably, on the National Security Resources Board, where other government departments exchanged confidential information. Livingston Merchant was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Far Eastern Affairs and a Special Assistant to Dean Rusk. He was retired and then brought back as a consultant. I would like to mention something about consultants. The State Department publishes a biographical register which shows the name and some background of all employees above a certain pay grade. They have a Foreign Service list which shows all the Foreign Service career officers who are serving throughout the world or in Washington. They have a telephone directory which shows everybody who has a telephone extension in Washington where they can be reached. But the consultants are not listed anywhere. So a subversive can be separated from the service and retained the next day as a consultant, and the only way you can find it out is to check the payroll records, and they will not supply you with the information. Now, the next one is Edwin M. Martin. Now listen carefully. Edwin M. Martin, listed as a Soviet agent. Aside from the fact that they were listed as Soviet agents, they had security files which showed their connection with communist front organizations, with communists, their views, what people said about them from their college days on. Now, Edwin M. Martin, one of these men I'm talking about, was appointed as an ambassador by President Nixon to the American mission to a division of the UN in Paris, where he is serving right now. Leonard Unger was appointed by President Nixon as a U.S. ambassador to Thailand. All of these people served in the State Department for many years, and each had a security file replete with derogatory information in addition to their having been named as Soviet agents. Other security risks named by President Nixon as ambassadors include Charles Yost to the UN, Alfred Puhan to Hungary, David Popper to Cyprus, Ellsworth Bunker to Vietnam, Samuel David Bunker, Assistant Ambassador to Vietnam, and finally Jacob Beam to Moscow. Now let's take a look at Jacob Beam. This is a fantastically interesting story. He was our ambassador to Poland during the late 1950s. In the American embassy, they held consultations between the Red Chinese and the American diplomats. It was the only place in the world it was going on. The Soviets decided they wanted to make sure that everything that happened there was known to them, and so they made a special effort, as they do, to make penetration in our embassies and consulates throughout the world. They were exceptionally successful in Warsaw because of the ambassador. And by the way, intelligence agencies had a file on Ambassador Beam going all the way back to 1934, when he was in Berlin, when he was closely associated with Martha Dodd, the daughter of the American ambassador. Martha Dodd was a Soviet agent. She had been for years. She married Alfred Stern. There was still an indictment pending in the Southern District of New York on espionage. They fled the country. And Martha Dodd and Jacob D. Beam had been very close, and reports were written about this going all the way back to the Hitler days in the American embassy in Berlin. Now, he kept being promoted and finally was made an ambassador. In the American embassy in Warsaw, a situation existed which is almost beyond comprehension. The communists have training schools. They have one in Czechoslovakia. They have another one in Moscow, and we understand they have one in Cuba. We haven't located that, where young girls are trained to use sex as a means of compromising. They're very fastidious in the Soviet Union. No one is allowed to engage in this type of work until they're 17 years old. But they send them to school when they're 14, and they study graces and dancing and invariably become fluent in a foreign language. And they are then used to compromise people, which is why we need diplomats with character to send overseas, and not the type of people we're sending. Actually, almost the entire embassy was compromised by female agents, except the security officer who was in charge. He was a homosexual. He was compromised by a male homosexual. Now, they had gone so far as to compromise the code books. Now, mind you, much of this information was made available through the hearings on State Department security by the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. As a matter of fact, Senator Thurman, in fact, the entire intelligence community, a wave of shock reached them when they heard that Jacob D. Beam was going to be the ambassador. There was a man in the embassy who had been a Soviet agent, a KGB agent for 18 years, one of the top assistants to Beam. Now, Jacob Beam had a girlfriend. She's now called Mrs. Jerry Michalowski, but she's had several other names. She's been in the United States before. She's a high-ranking member of the KGB. Her present husband, if she is married to him, because she changes the men as the Communist Party want her to, was the foreign minister of Communist Poland. This was the girlfriend. We had a man in Poland, a double agent, who was supplying our intelligence service with information on the KGB operations, not only in America, but throughout the world. Colonel Galanowski. He supplied over 5,000 microfilms, and his work was continuing until Jacob Beam passed the word to his girlfriend, and the first thing you know, the KGB began to close in, and our agent had to quickly come over into Germany and come to the United States. But it was Jacob Beam who made this possible. Now, the man who was the Soviet agent for 18 years, his name is Edward Simons. We mention names here, S-Y-M-A-N-S, from Grand Rapids, Michigan. The State Department, when Congressman inquired, said that Mr. Simons has been separated from our service and can never be employed in a security position again, and so forth. And everybody relaxed and said he's gone. But it isn't true. They gave him a passport. He went back to Europe. He stayed 2 months. He came back, was put on the payroll, was retired, is receiving a full pension, and living in Grand Rapids, and wrote a book, a historical book for the city of Grand Rapids. As a matter of fact, 2 years ago, his wife took a group of high school students to Europe under the auspices of the State Department. Daroslavs Vlahovic, a Yugoslavian-born American diplomat who was asked, the State Department was asked to send him out for Beam. He put the request in for him. He was named as being under Soviet control. John Berg, Charles Bemis, one after the other. Now Beam is in Moscow. His number 2 man there, the deputy chief of mission. When the ambassador is absent, the deputy chief of mission is acting as the ambassador. His name is Boris Clausen. In the 1940s, a female espionage agent was apprehended when she arrived in the United States. When they searched her, they found a secret notebook of her contacts In that contact book was the name of Boris Clausen with his present location. During his career in the State Department, he was known to have been careless with information, to have written reports that were written in such a way as to have security reports filed against him. More important, he was in Moscow at the time Lee Harvey Oswald defected and said he wants to become a Soviet citizen. I don't want anything more to do with the United States. He was trained by the KGB. We're absolutely convinced of this. He married the ward of a KGB colonel. There is no record anywhere in the Immigration or Naturalization Service or in our intelligence service where the relative of a high-ranking KGB agent has ever been allowed to leave Russia, unless that person was on a specific assignment. I challenge anybody to find a relative. They just don't allow it. They don't want defectors from the KGB, and you may be sure that Mariner Oswald was allowed to come for reasons that they knew about. Now, Oswald would never have been allowed to come back to the United States. He gave up his citizenship. He applied for Soviet citizenship. We knew many of the things that were going on, but a special report was written, and it said that he has changed his mind. He realizes he made a serious mistake. He's disillusioned with life in the Soviet Union. He wants to come back and be a good American citizen again. And that report was signed by Boris Clausen, who enabled Oswald to come back to the United States to kill President Kennedy. And they even gave him an advance of the money to come back to use to come with. You'll find that in the American Opinion. You'll also find that report itself in the Warren Commission. It's there for everybody to see. Let me give you another typical example. There's a man named Helmut Sonnenfeld. Helmut Sonnenfeld. I've written him up before. This man had a case against him for having passed information over to agents of a foreign power. And it was referred to the Attorney General for prosecution, an airtight case. The Attorney General decided no, it would be embarrassing to the American government if these facts were made known, and so the Attorney General refused to prosecute him. He was kept in the State Department, promoted. He is now assistant to Henry Kissinger. He went to Moscow and Peking with the president, and if you please, the Attorney General who decided not to prosecute him is our present Secretary of State, Mr. William Rogers. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've only got perhaps a half a minute left. They've tapped my shoulder. It's time to go. I wrote a book called Treason is Reason. It's out of print. I mentioned 200 security risks with documented facts. Many of them stayed on. I discussed the matter with Congressman Rarick. He said, if you write a series on the untouchables, the people in government who are security risks, he said, I'll put them in the congressional record so everybody will know, they will see them. And they were. And I've written 2 books, Untouchables 1 and Untouchables 2. They're here, in which we document the background of subversives in our government. They're there to see. Now we're doing them in the review of the news. Fortunately, there are more people who read the review of the news, apparently, than read my publication, because some of them are slipping into oblivion, some of them are retiring, and a few of them have almost disappeared. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish I had the opportunity to tell you more. What I've given you is only a fraction of the story of the State Department. In the charity of your prayers, pray for these misguided people, that God will open their mind and give them an opportunity to come back to God and country, because they don't know it, that they are expendable. Thank you, and God bless you.